Kia ora. Today is Boxing Day, the feast of St. Stephen. And being still Christmas tide, I thought in fact it's part of the 12 days of Christmas. This is day 2 of the 12 days of Christmas. Talk about in the 4 years between 1914 and 1918. The First World War killed and wounded more than 25 million people. And in popular opinion, at least, for less apparent purpose than any war before or since. By the end of 1914, more than 1 million soldiers were dead. The front line stretched some 500 miles from the Belgium coast to the Franco-Swiss border. And for 4 long years, it barely moved. Yet day in, day out, a generation of young men, some of whom were our relatives, decimated. But even in those desperate years, there was one small but radiant ray of light. Some call it a blip. In December 1914, for a brief moment, thousands of men had a glimpse that they were all in this together, as brothers, as humans. Somehow the pause button was pushed on the killing. For a few brief hours, and some places longer, in many places along the Western Front, men from both sides laid down their arms, emerged from their trenches, and shared food, carols, games, and comradeship. This Christmas truce was unofficial and illicit. Many officers disapproved, and headquarters on both sides took strong steps to ensure that it would not happen again. While it lasted, though, the truce was magical, leading even the sober Wall Street Journal to observe, "What appears from the winter fog and misery is a Christmas story, a fine Christmas story that is, in truth, the most faded and tattered of adjectives, inspiring." The first signs that something strange was happening occurred on Christmas Eve. At 8:30 p.m., an officer of the Royal Irish Rifles reported to headquarters. "Germans have illuminated their trenches, are singing songs and wishing us a happy Christmas. Compliments are being exchanged, but I'm nevertheless taking all military precautions." Further along the line, the two sides serenaded each other with carols. German Silent Night was met with a British chorus of the first Noel. And scouts met cautiously in no man's land, the shell-blasted waste between the trenches. The war diary of the Scots Guards records that a certain Private Merker met a German patrol and was given a glass of whiskey and some cigars. And a message was sent back saying that if we didn't fire at them, they wouldn't fire at us. The same basic understanding seems to have sprung up spontaneously at other spots. For another British soldier, Private Frederick Heath, the truce began late that same night when all down the line of trenches there came to our ears a greeting unique in war. English soldier, a Merry Christmas, a Merry Christmas." You would have a hard time believing it happened if it weren't for the abundance of historical evidence. Most Brits were stunned by how friendly the Germans were. Back home, they'd been incited by propaganda and manipulated by news in papers like the Daily Mail. More than 40% of newspaper circulation in Britain was controlled by one man, Lord Northcliffe, the Rupert Murdoch of his day. His papers and other papers portrayed Germans as ferocious Huns killing infants. On the other side, millions of German children learnt by heart a hymn called Hate Against England. German newspapers claimed the French and English were so godless they didn't even celebrate Christmas. Rutger Bregman, in his book Humankind, notes a pattern that the greater the distance from the front lines, the greater the hate. When we're up close to each other, when we see the other as a dim mirror of ourselves, hate becomes harder to sustain. For a long time, the 1914 Christmas Truce was treated as a fictitious tale, or worse, as a lie told by traitors. After that Christmas blip, the war resumed and millions more men were killed. It wasn't until the 1981 BBC documentary called Peace in No Man's Land that it became apparent that this tale was more than rumour. Fully 2/3 of the British front line ceased fighting. Most instances concerned Germans and Brits, although it happened also along Belgium and French lines. All told, more than 100,000 laid down their arms. In fact, says Bregman, the Peace of Christmas was not an isolated case. The same thing happened during the Spanish Civil War and the Boer Wars. It happened in the American Civil War and in the Crimean War and in the Napoleonic Wars. But nowhere was it as widespread as that Christmas in Flanders fields. It was in the British sector that troops noticed at dawn the Germans had placed small Christmas trees along parapets of their trenches. Slowly, parties of men from both sides began to venture forth from the barbed wire that separated them, until rifleman Oswald Tilley told his parents in a letter home, literally hundreds of each side were out in no man's land shaking hands. Common interest was football, soccer, which by then had been played professionally in Britain for a quarter of a century and in Germany since the 1890s. Perhaps it was inevitable that some men on both sides would produce a ball and, freed briefly from the confines of the trenches, take pleasure in kicking it about. What followed, though, was more than that. For if the story of Christmas Truce has a jewel, it is the legend of the match played between the British and Germans, a match that allegedly the Germans won 3-2. The first reports of such a contest surfaced a few days afterwards, on January the 1st, 1915. The Times published a letter written from a doctor attached to the Rifle Brigade, who reported a football match played between them and us in front of the trench. Braid's official history, though, insisted that no match took place. It would have been most unwise to allow the Germans to know how weakly the British trenches were held. Friendship, camaraderie, peace, most unwise. But there is plenty of evidence that soccer was played that Christmas Day, mostly by men of the same nationality, but at least 3 or 4 places between troops from opposing armies. This Christmas truce begs important questions, like how and why did it happen? And how can such truces be replicated? For we live in a world that feeds on binaries like good, bad, right, wrong, and ally, enemy. The enemies, the bad guys, them, are in too many movies, too many media stories, and too many people's minds where they're characterized as less than human, less than deserving of mercy, and less than us. Several factors combined to produce the conditions for this Christmas truce. By December 1914, the men in the trenches were veterans, familiar enough with the realities of combat to have lost much of the idealism that had carried them into war in August, and most longed for an end to the bloodshed. The war they had believed would be over by Christmas. Yet here they were at Christmas, still muddied, cold, and in battle. Those on the other side, the enemy, were literally 30 yards away across no man's land. Soldiers could yell out to each other. Truces were held to collect bodies and repair trenches. The weapons of war in 1914 had not yet degenerated to include heavy artillery, mortar, tanks, and gas, as became common in the years to come. This weaponry, by its very nature, is fired from a much greater distance than 30 yards. Maybe when you see the whites of their eyes, you might realize that your eyes have white around them too. When peace spread across those trenches in 1914, few soldiers were immune. Again and again, it was the men closest to the fighting that reached out first. Only leaders at the top proved resistant, as generals turned themselves inside out to halt this plague of peace and bolster patriotic aggression, which they did. Thousands of soldiers, though, did their best to sustain the peace. Letters were passed across the line in secret. Soldiers at some point managed to extend the ceasefire for weeks, and truces continued to break out in spite of all the suppressive measures. Military historian Tony Ashworth describes Christmas 1914 as the sudden surfacing of the whole of an iceberg. Not a blip, but something big, repressed under the surface. For even in wartime, says Bergman, there's a mountain of peace ready to rise up at any moment. To push that mountain back below the surface, generals and politicians have to draw on every means at their disposal. For humans are simply not wired for war. This is an ancient truth that powerful people often wish to quash, lest it catches on. The generosity to others makes us stronger, not might and armaments. The cooperation with others makes us powerful, not labeling others as enemy and seeking to have power over them. The friendship and love is what we most desire, and animosity and war do their best to kill friendship and love. Generosity, cooperation, friendship between all, even enemies, is very powerful stuff. I might have to ask him politely to stop. Hi, Finn. Say again, generosity, cooperation, friendship between all, even enemies, is powerful stuff. It's the stuff that members of the early Jesus movements found and replicated when together, and then wove into stories. They wove into the myth of Jesus' birth. Generosity, cooperation, and friendship between common people, strangers, even animals, is placed before us each Christmas for us to replicate. These truths are part of the ethos of the early Jesus movement that created the stories of his birth, stories and truths that we celebrate every Christmas. Blessings.